Welcome everybody. My name is Angie and I'm an undergraduate nursing student.
And I'm Larissa, an undergraduate psychology student. And we are work study students with Voice Campus Health. We want to thank you for taking your time to join us today.
We are here today to discuss the legalization of recreational cannabis and the implications that this will have for our campus community.
Policies and regulations related to the distribution and use of recreational cannabis are under development across the country. It is new territory for everyone. Discussions have begun about a policy related to recreational cannabis for UBC. However, this work is ongoing. Our aim today, therefore, is not to discuss or respond to a draft policy for UBC, but to hear about and discuss some of the issues associated with the legalization of recreational cannabis for our campus community.
We are honored to welcome 7 experts today to talk about their different perspectives, research, and work on this topic.
First, we would like to respectfully acknowledge the Selks Okanagan and their peoples in whose territory we stand and are gathered upon today.
Voice is a campus health project that uses participatory methods to identify priorities and create change to promote well-being on campus. Our work is guided by the Okanagan Charter for Health Promoting Universities and Colleges, an outcome of the international conference hosted at the Okanagan campus. The Okanagan Charter was formally adopted by UBC Okanagan in October 2016.
The Charter has 2 calls of action for higher education institutions. 1, embed health into all aspects of campus culture across the administration, operations, and academic mandates. And 2, lead health promotion action and collaboration locally and globally.
We would now like to introduce everyone to our panel today. Daniela Mitchell and Janine Mintz are Bachelor of Science in Nursing students who worked with the Voice Campus Health project here at UBC Okanagan for their 4th year leadership project.
Michelle Thiessen chairs the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy Club here on campus and is a master's student in clinical psychology here at UBC Okanagan.
Dr. Ian Mitchell is an associate clinical professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine, Faculty of Medicine, and Southern Medical Program at UBC Okanagan.
Dr. Zach Walsh is an associate professor of psychology here at UBC Okanagan and oversees the Therapeutic, Recreational, and Problematic Substance Use Lab. Zach will be joining us today live from Costa Rica.
Shelley Kafish is the Director of Campus Operations and Risk Management here at UBC Okanagan and is also a member of the Marijuana Policy Development Committee at UBC.
And finally, Michael Serebrikov is on the legal counsel at UBC working at the Vancouver campus and is the secretary for the Marijuana Policy Development Committee. So firstly, we would now like to welcome Janine and Daniela.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniela Mitchell.
And I'm Janine Mintz, and we are both 4th year nursing students here at UBCO. Last semester, we partnered with Campus Health to complete our Nursing 414 leadership project titled Curious About Cannabis.
We thought this project topic was timely because of the known Canadian cannabis legalization changes for 2018. We worked on this project from September to December of 2017. We want to take a moment to acknowledge fellow nursing students Braden Kulich and Gabriella Michelin, who are also a part of this project but were unable to attend today's event.
In addition, we were guided by both our instructor, Lisa Moralejo, and mentor through Campus Health, Chelsea Hartwig. We want to thank them for their help and support, as we could not have accomplished the work we did without them.
The focus of our Nursing 414 leadership practice experience was to demonstrate leadership, knowledge, and skills, and to influence change in relation to a relevant and significant health problem. We believe that the legalization changes of cannabis would have a degree of impact on the well-being and life at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan.
The 3 goals of our project were to, number 1, provide cannabis-related information to the campus community. Number 2, capture opinions and perspectives of UBCO students, staff, and faculty on the scheduled legalization changes of cannabis. And lastly, to start conversations with the campus community to determine questions, concerns, and next steps for the topic.
We thought an appropriate first step in providing education to the campus community was by preparing a brochure on what is already known and researched about cannabis. This step in the project further educated our group members on cannabis as well. We created a brochure and poster that discussed the types of cannabis, their uses, intended effects, side effects, and methods to achieve the intended use in a safer manner. We also utilized the Government of Canada's Health Effects of Cannabis handout, as well as their fact sheet on legalizing and strictly regulating cannabis.
After solidifying our project idea and beginning our educational brochure, we met with Dr. Zach Walsh and Michelle Thiessen, who are both presenters here today. We engaged in conversation with these campus stakeholders to share our project idea, ask questions from these expert practitioners, hear from Dr. Walsh about his research, and chat with Michelle about her role with Students for Sensible Drug Policy and her master's work.
We left our meeting feeling energized that we had the opportunity to connect with campus members who were also invested and keen to do more work on the topic of cannabis within our community. We felt confident in our project moving forward, and we knew we could reach out to Dr. Zach Walsh and Michelle as needed.
The next phase of our project was to engage with the campus community by creating question boxes related to cannabis knowledge, attitudes, opinions, and perspectives. On the outside of each box, we asked one prompting question. The questions included, do you know about the upcoming legalization changes for cannabis?
How do you think this legalization change is going to affect campus life?
How do you feel about cannabis on campus?
What are some regulations you would like to have in place once cannabis is legalized?
We placed the anonymous question boxes around campus on October 17th. We collected the questions weekly and changed the location of the boxes weekly to target different populations within the campus community. We continued the schedule for 4 weeks.
Due to the amount of interest and participation with the cannabis question boxes, we decided to participate in Thrive Week here at UBCO.
Thrive Week is an initiative set out by UBC to engage students, staff, and faculty in thoughtful reflection, dialogue, and actions that support and build positive mental health.
We thought the topic was relevant and fitting for Thrive Week due to the potential mental health effects it may have. So for our booth, we put together a poster and brochures that provided information about the known legalization changes, types of cannabis, and methods to use it, while also generating conversation and touching on some concerns that were expressed in the question boxes.
We encouraged people at our booth to ask questions and express their concerns. We also brought one of the question boxes so people could write down their thoughts anonymously there.
We also shared the Government of British Columbia's online survey about cannabis legalization, where it went through the different sections of the Cannabis Act and asked questions on topics like minimum age, personal possession limits, public consumption, and drug-impaired driving. We encouraged the campus community members to fill out the survey as a way to actively participate in shaping the way cannabis legalization is going to happen here in British Columbia.
After collecting all the responses from the question boxes and reading notes we had written down after engaging in conversation with this campus community, we organized our information. In total, we received 95 responses over a period of 4 weeks.
We are going to take a moment to share our findings from the question boxes and from conversations we had with community members.
More than half of the responders were unaware of the legalization occurring in 2018, but were curious to know what exactly it entailed.
Less than 10 responders shared that they had never tried cannabis and wanted to once it was legalized.
10 responders raised a concern about where cannabis could and should be consumed on campus.
One responder voiced concerns about cannabis use and its negative impact on academic performance.
About half of responders believed cannabis should be treated the same way alcohol is. They believe that there should be designated places to consume cannabis, similar to a bar, where they can go purchase any form of cannabis and hang out with their friends to consume the substance in a safe environment.
We received 15 responses that were very opposed to the legalization process. Their concerns included people driving under the influence to and from campus, as well as the unpleasant smell that would linger after use. One response addressed the fact that having cannabis on campus might lower UBCO's standards and ranking among other universities in Canada and around the world.
We also identified a gap in knowledge regarding consumption, effects on the body, and what long-term effects might look like.
All in all, we had an overwhelming response of people who were in favor of the legalization. Many hoped to use the substance on and off campus, and some expressed their hopes of being able to grow their own. Others expressed the desire to open a cannabis bar on campus where we would be able to set a precedent for other schools in Canada.
The last step in our project was to share our information from the question boxes with Michelle Thiessen to then further share them with the Students for Sensible Drug Policy group.
Our project came to an end when the semester was wrapping up. In this current semester, we are completely off campus and are in the hospital for our final clinical experiences.
We are glad to see that our project is continuing to be used to progress the legalization process of cannabis on campus. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Janine and Daniela. Next, we would like to invite Michelle Thiessen to speak.
Hi, so I'm Michelle Thiessen, and I'm the chair of Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Okanagan. So I wanted to share a little bit about our organization to help inform why we did what we did. So Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a grassroots network of youth and students across Canada who are concerned about the negative impact drug policies have on their communities, their friends, their families. So we engage in a lot of different activities to help address these concerns. So we advocate for evidence-based drug information. We try to advocate for the increase of harm reduction supplies on campus. And we like to engage with our peers on topics pertaining to drug policy. So we organized a dialogue, and we had a guiding principle of nothing about us without us. So we used this guiding principle because we felt that it was really important to engage with other students on campus for a policy that's going to affect students more than anyone. So there is a marijuana policy development committee, but we wanted to provide them with a wealth of information and perspectives from a large group of students. So we had about 25 students from a bunch of different programs, undergraduates and graduates come out and take part in the day. So we put together a discussion paper that we provided to participants before they came to the event. So this was to ensure that everyone had the same baseline knowledge. So the discussion paper included things like the various uses of cannabis, medical, recreational, spiritual, and problematic. We also highlighted some things from the Cannabis Act, so the government's proposed bill. And we discussed some of the policies that exist for cannabis on campus, which of course were just restricted to medical use, so in residence and outside of it. As I said, we had 25 participants come out, and apologies for the text-heavy slide, but I wanted to give you an idea of the diversity of participants we had so that you can keep that in mind when I go into the different kind of consensus that came out of it. So we had students represented from psychology, social work, nursing, physics, engineering, economics, biology, management, and English. And we had the VP external from UBC SUO, Amal, come out as a representative. And we also hired a note taker that was not associated with our group at all, just so that we could have a little bit more objectivity in transcribing the discussions from that day. So I'll go over the few topics that we discussed. So these were all presented in the discussion paper, and then the day of the event, we worked through each of these. So we would put up a topic on the screen, and then we'd ask that everyone go and independently write down some of their feelings, some of their concerns about this. Then we asked them to workshop it in a small group, about 5 to 6 people, that had a moderator or facilitator at each table. And then we came back as a large group, and each table shared kind of the group consensus from their table or discussed the potential conflicts that had arose. So the first question, or the first topic was, should UBC allow students to use cannabis on campus? And what would constitute a responsible space for students to use cannabis? So there were some concerns raised, and these were primarily associated with the fact that there's going to be some individuals on campus that aren't of legal age to use it. So just like we have with alcohol, you have friend groups that may have 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and they're all hanging out on the weekend, having a good time, and so there's that risk that some underage individuals may then be, offered cannabis. So this isn't too unlike what's going on with alcohol, except for that there is some pretty harsh penalties if you are to provide someone that's underage with cannabis. So this was definitely a legitimate concern. However, the group consensus was that the campus community should be permitted to use cannabis on campus in designated spaces. All right, so then we discussed options for use. So there were 3 options that people came up with. The first one feels obvious on the surface, and that's to use the existing gazebos. We have a number of gazebos on campus where you can smoke tobacco. However, the problem with this is that there's going to be some cross smoke. So some tobacco users were saying that they were concerned that they would leave smelling like cannabis if they were going elsewhere, going to class, going back to work, and they didn't want people to think that they were using cannabis. There's also the obvious concern of increasing the harms associated with being exposed to secondhand smoke. So overall, didn't seem like this was a very good option for students. The next option that people discussed was cannabis-only gazebos. So this seems like a good solution for the cross smoke, and it is. However, we're trying to reduce the number of smoking gazebos on campus, so the idea that we're just going to multiply them doesn't seem like a very feasible option, and just the infrastructure required might not be feasible. So then, what everyone kind of came to agree on was an indoor space. So we already have indoor spaces on campus that are used for research purposes that are well ventilated. So we know that cannabis can be consumed indoor in a way that doesn't it doesn't go and kind of poison the environment around. So everyone in the students in your question boxes was saying that they're so worried about the smell. And that's a good concern. It can be a little bit smelly. So an indoor space addresses the concern of cross smoke, and it addresses the concern of smell, and it also incentivizes safer cannabis use practices, which would be vaporizing. So if we can provide a space that students could come and just vaporize, then they're not going to be smoking it. All right, so topic 2, should students be able to purchase cannabis on campus, and should students be allowed to grow cannabis for personal use in residence? We had this event before BC came out with some of their legislation, so it looks like at this time there might not be an option for people to go and purchase cannabis from a lounge and then say use it in that space. But looking forward, that likely will become a thing, so we'll talk about it here. So the group consensus was that cannabis should be available for purchase on campus in the form of a single use. So much like we have a bar here, you can go and you can purchase a beer, you can engage socially with your peers, but you can't purchase off sales. So that was the format that students thought would be the most appropriate. A group consensus was not reached for growing cannabis. Some stated that other plants are allowed to be grown in dorms, such as like a tomato plant. There's no rules against that, so why should there be with cannabis? But of course, there's a whole bucket of things that you have to be concerned about in growing cannabis and it being diverted to people that maybe are underage, et cetera. So the group just as a whole figured that that maybe wasn't something that we should explore further. Topic 3 was in regards to medical cannabis. So there isn't really a firm framework for medical cannabis on campus. And the group thought that regardless of what happens with the non-medical cannabis policy, that a medical policy should be instated. And at present, there's no designated space for someone to go and use medical cannabis. So this is a little bit of a concern, given that if you're caught using cannabis on campus, security has every right, as they should, to come up and ask you, or tell you, notify you of the rules that you can't use cannabis on campus. However, as a medical patient, that may be an experience that you really don't want to engage in, and having to provide, your confirmation of diagnosis or providing paperwork that shows you're authorized might be something that you want to avoid. So one of the students brought up the fact that with the DRC, some students have access to a room with a Salto key. So it's secure, only a certain amount of students have access to that room, and they thought that that would be a great option that the university could consider. So regardless of whether or not they allow cannabis on campus, providing a space for medical users did seem like a priority. There are several ways that people choose to consume cannabis, and having a policy that appreciates those differences could be beneficial. And then we also wanted to know if students thought that UBC should be providing workshops on cannabis use, or if students should just be seeking that information external from the university. So students thought that it was important to treat vaporized cannabis separately from smoked cannabis because of the different health concerns. So by incentivizing vaporized cannabis, by maybe broadening the scope of where it's allowed or how it's allowed to be used, that might then encourage students to use a less harmful method. Finally, education, we had a lot of great discussion about that. One of the students referred to it as a re-education because those that have gone through high school weren't really taught how to use cannabis safely or how to reduce the harms associated with it, just that there were harms in general. So by providing workshops to students on all of the evidence, they can then go out and make decisions that work for them. And finally, just echoing what you guys found actually was some students said that UBC can be a national leader if they embrace cannabis. If they propose a policy that is progressive and inclusive, that UBC could be a leader. So, thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Next, please welcome Dr. Ian Mitchell.
Thank you for having me here today to talk about the health effects of cannabis. My role actually on campus, I hadn't been involved with UBC Okanagan up until a couple of years ago when I became a qualified investigator for a study we're running on campus here looking at the effects of cannabis on PTSD symptoms. And my role in that study as the qualified investigator is to look after the health of those participants. That's really my main role aside from guiding along the study or design. My real responsibility in that is protecting the health of the participants within that. I'm just going to start, I'm going to change my order up a little bit just because something recently happened in the York region. There was a Catholic school board asked to be educated by some drug experts from the police force. And unfortunately, there's now become a backlash as these police officers so badly inform the students they have to go back and redact their stories and clear up the misinformation that was provided. So they told these students that fentanyl is commonly found as an adulterant in cannabis. This has actually never been confirmed in Canada. Okay? They also talked about doobies causing boobies, that if you smoke joints, it can cause gynecomastia, breast enlargement. Again, doesn't happen. The study that showed that doesn't happen happened 40 years ago. They said that smoking half a joint was as bad as drinking 7 alcoholic beverages. Again, completely untrue. So, as much as I hope that we're reaching a new area of information, we're still stuck with a lot of old urban mythology, and I hope to disrupt some of that today. So, my primary job is working in the emergency department. I work in the Royal Inland Hospital in Kamloops doing emergency medicine. And cannabis isn't part of my practice there. I don't see a lot of people with cannabis problems there, but occasionally it does happen. So why would you come to see me? Because of a cannabis-related emergency. Well, the first thing is overdose. And this has been a problem more before, and it's going to be a problem more again, people just taking too much. And part of the problem with that is mostly in edibles. And with edibles, it can take a long time for that to really take effect in people. It can take an hour and a half to 2 hours. So people are like, well, I took some, didn't work, hour goes by, take more, take twice as much, see what happens. And then you spend the next day on the floor, or you have to come see Emerge. I had a patient who had brain cancer, and her father was helping her package oil capsules. And just over the heat and the oil, got up and fell over, couldn't walk. So these things happen, and patients will come to the emergency department for this. But overall, it's a minimal kind of thing. It's an overdose that people are going to laugh about later. And, you know, it's not a big deal. People are a bit dizzy and they just can't walk, but after a while in the Emerge, they're sorted out and they're fine. They can walk themselves home. But it does really highlight the danger of edibles. So if you are keeping edibles, and, you know, I'd say for students, if you're keeping edibles, they have to be labeled. They can't be left out where someone else is going to find them, because sure enough, it's going to be one of your relatives, probably your mom. Cannabis hyperemesis syndrome is a kind of unusual phenomenon that actually, I do see an emergency, and we've got a few people that come regularly, and it's just important for people to be aware that this exists as an entity. This is an unusual phenomenon where people who smoked a lot of pot for a lot of years develop crazy abdominal pain and vomiting. And all the tests are negative, nothing ever comes of it. They're investigated, CT scans, everything, nothing is found. Typically, their only relief comes from taking hot showers. That's kind of one of the real hallmarks of the syndrome. And when they come into emergency department, we treat them with antipsychotics and hot pepper rub to their belly. Okay, odd kind of thing, real weird. But a lot of people don't know about it. So if they don't know about it, they're just like, well, I got this pain, I don't know what's going on. I'm just going to smoke some more pot to help with my pain or my nausea. Okay, and it gets into a vicious cycle that way. Impairment, obviously I deal with a lot of trauma in the emergency department, and cannabis is impairing, and there's no way that you can say that it is not. And there have been some studies that show they weren't able to detect impairment. The thing is, the impairment overall is much less than alcohol. When we talk about impairment from cannabis, it's going to increase the risk of accident by about 60%. Okay? And that's concerning enough as it is. but the equivalent factor for alcohol is 1,600%. Okay, so we're just talking magnitudes of difference between cannabis and alcohol. And that's one of the real problems we face, is how to police that going forward. Schizophrenia, Zach is going to address this in a lot more detail. Certainly people do end up in the emergency department because they have schizophrenia and they use a lot of cannabis. Certainly if they're using the high THC cannabis, this can make their symptoms worse. And there are definitely people who shouldn't smoke cannabis because it makes their symptoms worse. Having said that, there's people that can also benefit from components of cannabis like CBD, cannabidiol, which is actually shown to help symptoms of schizophrenia. Overall, my impression, we'll hear from Zach as well, is that from the literature, cannabis smoking can bring on the symptoms of schizophrenia a bit earlier or make them more severe, but it doesn't make people have schizophrenia who wouldn't otherwise develop it. There are some other things that are really very rare and really don't apply to this population. There's a very small risk of stroke, very small risk of heart attack. Allergies are very uncommon. None of these are big risk factors for these conditions, but they've just things that have been picked up in the literature. The long-term effects of cannabis overall seem to be relatively minimal. Most people worry about the lungs more than anything, and I'm a doctor, I don't like people smoking anything. That's what vaporizers are for. But what we found so far is that smoking cannabis doesn't seem to lead to emphysema, doesn't lead to COPD, doesn't lead to lung cancer, doesn't lead to mouth or throat cancer. And there's good literature to support those. So for some reason, and we still are unclear as to why, smoking cannabis doesn't have the same repercussions that tobacco does. The reproductive system, we're seeing more women smoking cannabis during pregnancy, and we really don't know what the end results of that are. There's some studies showing that there's some slight cognitive abnormalities detected later on in life. Overall, as far as birth weight and birth presentations, there doesn't seem to be any great harms, but we just do not have the information available to know what effect that is. For men, there's been some science showing that cannabis can decrease the sperm count or make the sperm oddly shaped, but overall it doesn't seem to affect fertility. Cognitive changes, again, very minimal findings, and Zach's going to talk a little bit more about that. There are benefits, though. Benefits to cannabis. What we've seen in studies, there's decreased liver and bladder cancer. There's decreased progression in alcohol liver disease to cirrhosis and cancer. There's lower weight, decreased alcohol consumption. People substitute cannabis for more harmful drugs like opiates. And we're talking around the health aspects of cannabis, around the lower use health guidelines. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these guidelines suggest. And one of the first things they suggest is abstinence. And so I'd also like to recommend that all the students stay abstinent until marriage. I'm not sure how feasible that is, but really, look, I'm a harm reduction guy. I'm not about abstinence, and I don't expect that people at college of all places are going to remain abstinent from these substances. But I would say, if you are going to say no, just say no to the synthetic cannabinoids. These are drugs like K2 and Spice, made in a lab. They've never really been tested on humans, and those do come with some very significant side effects, such as stroke and heart attack. As I said, I'm more harm reduction, so how can we give people better guidance about what to do as far as minimizing what harms there are? And the first, as Michelle mentioned, was vaporizing. That's going to be the way forward. We're seeing this in tobacco as well, people moving away from cigarettes, more into e-cigarettes, and way healthier and less chance of burns and house fires, all kinds of reasons to get away from combustion. But really primary among them is the health aspect. What we're seeing on the street, people purchasing high THC products. That's what's on the street. People want to get high. And that's what seems to be linked to schizophrenia. So what I think we're going to see with a regulated market is more people having a balance of THC and CBD so that they minimize the effects of THC and minimize the risk of schizophrenia. When can you drive? There's different numbers out there. Some people say 3 hours, some people say 4 hours, some people say 6 hours. I don't think a time element is really helpful. There's an app for that. There's apps called Druid and My Canary, and it's a thing you hold up and you kind of balance on one leg and hold, and it'll measure how impaired you are. And you can set a baseline, then you can use it for drinking or cannabis to tell if you are safe to drive. And take a break. Be responsible. Shouldn't be every day. Should be weekends. You know, that's what we're doing with alcohol as well. If you're drinking every day, that's going to be a problem. This shouldn't be such an integrated part of your life that you have to have it every day. So take a break, be responsible. And Carl Hart is a drug guy in the States, and you know, his advice to children, or parents talking to children about drugs, is, are they fulfilling their responsibilities? Are they going to school? Are they fulfilling their social obligations? If they're not, then that's drug abuse. If they're integrating this drug into their life while maintaining all the responsibilities, that's okay. We can live with that. We can go forward with that. So I just ask, you know, don't limit yourself by these substances. Don't define yourself by these substances. It can be part of your life, just don't make it everything there is. Thanks so much, and I guess we're doing questions after.
All right, thank you, Ian. Next, we have Dr. Zach Walsh joining us live from Costa Rica.
Hello, everybody. It's really exciting to be at this event. I'm thrilled to be part of it, and good to see so many familiar faces on the panel. I can't see the audience, but I'm sure there's familiar faces there as well. So great to be here, and thanks for having me at this. If we can switch slides, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and what I want to talk about today. And Ian had mentioned that I might speak a little bit about mental health and schizophrenia and cognitive stuff, and I'm happy to chat about that if people have questions afterwards. But what I really want to talk about today is this exciting study that we're doing here on campus about the impact of cannabis legalization on young adults. And it really is honor to be part of this work. We've been working on cannabis for a number of years here on campus, doing some research with undergrads and also doing some clinical research and work with dispensaries. But it's exciting that we're going to be able to get to tell part of the story of cannabis legalization. I feel like in media we're getting a lot of the fine-grained analysis of how things are changing and the ups and downs of the process, but I really just want to remind people that this is a very exciting time for Canada. We're the first large country to legalize cannabis. I expect a lot of nations are going to be following us in the next decade or half decade. So the world is going to be watching, and being able to tell part of that story in the Okanagan, I think, is really exciting. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the study. It's called the Multi-Method Evaluation of the Transition to Cannabis Legalization. So the study, you can see it's part of an initiative by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Health Intervention Research on legalization of cannabis. And there's Bill Blair. You can see his picture. He's very excited to be able to provide that funding for us. And the formal title of the study is a multi-method approach to establishing baseline and monitoring change. So what we want to do is we want to figure out where people are at now before legalization, and fortunately we have data already on that, and we're going to be getting more detailed data. And then we want to follow people across this transition to legalization to see how it changes. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the design of the study in just a moment. But very grateful to CIHR for the funding and for UBC for being supportive of this research over the past half decade or so, when it wasn't as clear that it was going to be the way we're going. So glad to be here at this time. And if we could just change the slide, thanks. So these are our aims. And at the most basic level, we want to see how legalization impacts levels and modes of smoking and access. So when it comes to levels, I think one of the big questions, and it's sort of an obvious question in a way, is legalization going to cause people to use more cannabis? We know that there are pretty high rates of cannabis use on campus already. It could be that people who are using cannabis are already using it, and legalization won't make a big difference. That is, in general, what we've seen from some of the states that have legalized cannabis, and also what we've seen from Uruguay, which legalized it as an entire nation. Also in countries like Portugal, where they've had more broad decriminalization, we don't really see huge increases in cannabis use. We do see some minor increases in some adults trying cannabis, But in general, I don't expect that we're going to see big increase in levels of use. I think it'll probably remain pretty solid. It's just the folks who are using cannabis will be using legal and edited cannabis. And that's our next question. Are people going to transition into the legal market? Do we expect to see people continue to get their illegal cannabis, or are they going to be accessing it from legal sources? And a lot of that's going to do with how accessible and how appealing the legal market's going to be. So we're very interested in those things. Are they going to use more? Are they going to get it legally, illegally? And one thing I think is hopeful is when we have a legal market, we may have more options around cannabis products. And if that's the case, it'll be interesting to see whether or not people take advantage of those to use less harmful modes of administration. As a few people have mentioned already, vaporization rather than smoking. How can we perhaps encourage uptake of safer cannabis use, and where do we have to measure it first? So that's our first aim, is just to get baseline on how people are using cannabis now, and to see whether or not this formal legal change makes a big difference. The other thing we're interested in is how does it change attitudes and ideas about cannabis. So cannabis is still stigmatized. I mean, it's an illicit substance. So are people going to change the way they think about cannabis use? And I think that goes in a couple directions. On one level, people may become more accepting, it may become more mainstream, more normative. At the same time, I think there's a certain allure to things being prohibited. So perhaps, a joke in our lab for a while has been that we're trying to make cannabis boring. So is cannabis going to become more boring now that it's legal, and perhaps something that people are maybe less identified with, maybe the identity of I'm a cannabis user and that's who I am, maybe that becomes less a part of it and it's just more mainstream, and maybe the attitudes change both ways, where it becomes maybe less cool, or but on the other end maybe less stigmatized. So it's going to be down the middle. One thing that's really important when we look at the public health effects of cannabis legalization is how it impacts the use of other drugs. In our lab is cannabis substitution. Cannabis just ends up getting piled on with a lot of other substances, then I don't think we're going to see any real benefits, or we might see only small ones, or maybe negative effects as people mix drugs. But if people choose cannabis rather than more dangerous substances, and alcohol is certainly top of mind there, are we going to see reduced alcohol use? And I know from working on the campus and speaking with campus security over the years, a lot of the problems on campus, and we have a very safe and lovely campus, but to the extent that there are problems, a lot of them are related to alcohol use. So could we perhaps see a reduction in some of those problems related to people substituting cannabis for alcohol? And of course, we're also interested in how it impacts the use of opiates and other substances that are used on campus. Downstream from that, and touching on it, is how does it affect the psychosocial health consequences? So that's a big word for how does it affect how people live, mental health, general well-being. So not just is it causing pronounced state, but what about people's quality of life? Are they enjoying life more? Are they enjoying it less? Are they able to? Is it detracting from interpersonal relationships? Is it contributing to them? How does it impact school performance? I think is a really big question that we want to know. And are these things going to change with legalization? So we're trying to get a really comprehensive view of how legalization is going to impact young adults, and particularly young adults at UBCO, who we hope are representative more broadly of young adults across Canada. And of course, we're aware that these factors can be modified by gender, by ethnicity, and by other individual differences in personality. So we're going to be collecting a large enough sample that we can look at the subgroup, see if it's the same, assume that it's going to have the same effects on everyone. On the next slide, we have a diagram illustrating how these things are interrelated. On the top, we can see that legalization of non-medical cannabis use, and we think that's going to perhaps impact levels and modes of cannabis use, as we discussed. It could also affect attitudes, and then those attitudes might affect levels and modes of use. And that's a bidirectional arrow there, because the levels and modes of cannabis use might also affect the attitude. So if people are using more cannabis or using less cannabis, that may affect the way people perceive it. The use of other substances may also be affected by levels and modes of use. So if people are using more, they may use less of something else. And at the same time, that may feed back. People find that they stop or not using, when they go out on a Friday night or a Saturday night, if they're going to planning on using alcohol, maybe they're going to be planning on using cannabis head. So that could go both ways. So we're interested in how that interacts well. A piece of that I think may have consequences beyond our campus is we're going to be asking people how much they would pay for various types of cannabis and looking at how that impacts costs of alcohol. So when we come to discuss these interactions between cannabis and alcohol use, how available alcohol use is, how the price compares to cannabis, all of those things may impact the relative uptake of those different substances and down the road impact the health consequences. So we're going to be doing some experimental work looking at how levels of hypothetical pricing impact cannabis consumption. At the end of the day, what we're really concerned about is what are the psychosocial health consequences. So how does it impact people's relationships, and how does it impact their school performance? How does it impact their quality of life? How does it impact their mental health? And both of those things are going to be related to levels of use and also the use of other substances. So all our goals in this research are interrelated, and hopefully it'll give us a pretty good picture of the impact of legalization on the folks of interest. And a little bit more detail about the study comes on the next slide. We're going to be starting off with a large screener where we'll look for people's levels of substance use and their well-being. And then we're going to follow people up pre-legalization and post-legalization to see if we get changes. So on top of asking questionnaires and interviews, also going to be what we call ecological momentary assessment, where people get sent texts and are asked, when did you last use cannabis? Are you craving cannabis? What are you doing right now? To get a real in-the-moment assessment of how people are relating to cannabis, as well as some tests looking at norms. How many people do people expect are using cannabis? One thing that we see is people overestimate how many of their student colleagues are using cannabis. So we want to see those estimates, those normative estimates we call them, if those come more or less in line with reality following legalization. So in total, we're hoping to follow 200 cannabis users and 100 non-cannabis users for comparison purposes. We want to hear from you what might be missing. And Michelle, who you heard from earlier in her role from Canadian Student Drug Policy, is also a research coordinator for the study, the very busy research and cannabis policy expert. So please let her know what you think we might be missing, what you'd like to hear more about. Very interested in getting feedback for this study, because when we get this baseline before legalization, we can only get that once. So we want to make sure that we don't miss anything. So please don't hesitate. We really want to get feedback from the audience here about how we're doing and if we seem to be missing. So take down that email if you will, and please contact Michelle and she'll pass it to the rest of the study team. And when I talk about the study team, the next slide describes the group. It's certainly not me alone. So you Marvin Cranksman, my colleagues from UBC Psychology are co-investigators, as well as MJ Malloy, a cannabis researcher from UBC Vancouver and the BC Centre for Substance Use. Michelle, who you met earlier, Tracy Hawthorne from UBC Wellbeing, Roger Wilson with Health and Wellness, and Chelsea Hartwig is also here as a campus health specialist. So it's a big team, and we couldn't do it without the support of the whole campus, and we hope to hear from all of you, your thoughts as well. So thank you very much for your attention and for your giving me a chance to talk about the study. It's an exciting time for us in our lab. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach. Next, we would like to welcome Shelley Kfish.
And Michael.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Serbakov, and I'm one of the legal counsel working with the Office of University Counsel in Vancouver. And I'm also the secretary of the Marijuana Policy Development Committee, which is what we initially called it, but after learning a lot of things on the committee, I realized that cannabis is the proper nomenclature, and that is what we'll be using throughout our policies. Our presentation is not going to be quite as exciting as the previous ones, because I will just launch into summarizing the federal act that's going to be coming into effect in what you thought was July, but now might be pushed towards August or perhaps even later in the year. So Bill C-45, which is going to be the Cannabis Act, will legalize, possession of certain amounts of certain forms of marijuana, as well as the sale and distribution of certain types of cannabis. Edibles will not be approved for sale when the legislation comes into place. They say they're going to take a little more time to study the issues around that. They're saying maybe another year until we see the sale of those. There's a restriction on the promotion of cannabis, which essentially limits to places where persons under the age of 18 are not allowed to enter. They will be permitting the cultivation of up to 4 cannabis plants per dwelling house. Now, the definition of dwelling house is not clearly defined, but the way we're reading it right now, we're assuming that it means, individual, apartment blocks in a larger block. There are notable omissions from the Act, such as, there's no restrictions on places of consumption and no comprehensive vendor regimes. These have been left to the individual provinces to develop. Now, there have been several aspects of cannabis legislation that province of British Columbia announced in December. For instance, it did set the minimum age for purchase and possession of 19. And did reveal that the government will run the wholesale distribution of cannabis while using a hybrid sort of public and private vendors to actually distribute it. There, however, have not been any details released on the sort of the restriction as to where cannabis can be consumed and in what forms. For instance, in Ontario, they've released their draft legislation and they are prohibiting consumption of cannabis in all public places, so essentially restricting it to private residences. Alberta's regime is more permissive. They are restricting, for instance, smoked cannabis use to where they already don't allow tobacco use, plus an extra set of places within prescribed distances of playgrounds and sports fields. But we haven't heard yet from province of BC as to what's going to happen here.
All right, so that leads us to the committee itself. The committee was assembled by the Office of University Council to ensure that UBC was prepared for the Act. Despite many unknowns. Various UBC policies and guidelines were reviewed to identify where we have gaps and what might be needed in terms, or what might need to be filled to respond to the legalization. Possible changes were also discussed with the aim of the campus responding positively and comprehensively to the change in the law. So the committee reviewed many aspects of upcoming changes, including how will the university address the consumption of cannabis, either in its smoked form or as an edible? Will the new rules and guidelines regarding on-campus impairment need to be implemented? How will UBC handle the accommodation for medical use and for addiction? How will the issue of use and possession in student residences be handled? And will the sale of cannabis be permitted on campus? To give you a feel for what was discussed, after reviewing all of the material, the committee concluded that the university is generally in good shape with respect to existing policies and practices and more or less prepared for the passing of the Act. However, certain conversations need to be had. These are very early days, and as Michael said, there's a lot of unknowns that we'll need to respond to.
And I will just go over some of the aspects of the discussion at the committee level. For instance, impairment, we've reviewed our existing, guidelines and code of conduct and concluded that, impairment can still be handled by existing policies. We already addressed impairment by alcohol, impairment by other drugs, so there's no need to change anything at this time. Similarly, with accommodation, just want to preface that with the exception of the conversations been happening here with gazebos, accommodation for instance, medical cannabis use or cannabis addiction. Now, these will be handled by, again, current policies and guidelines, both from the sort of human resources perspective and the students' perspective.
So the topic is smoking. Smoking on campus is currently covered within Policy 15, which can be found on our UBC website. Cannabis is covered by the wording of this policy. So when on the Vancouver campus, they restrict smoking from the indoors, inside UBC vehicles and near doorways. As many of you are aware, and as discussed already, at the Okanagan, through Policy 15, smoking is only permitted to designated gazebos that are strategically in place to ensure compliance with policy restrictions. While there are conversations on both campuses around moving towards a smoke-free UBC, the committee also looked at the use of gazebos for smoking cannabis. Some of the topics that we discussed included the potential intoxication of tobacco users of the gazebos, particularly for people taking a work break or a class break. And we even thought about our bus drivers, right? And we do have a gazebo located near the Transit Exchange now. Concerns of cannabis users as it relates to secondhand smoke. I know the topic of smell has also come up here that we've noted. Potentially restricting hours for gazebo cannabis use, kind of similar to our pub. Designating one of our gazebos for cannabis use. And the difficulty in siting new gazebos due to policy restrictions and our build-out, the expansion of campus. When I started here in 2005, the gazebos were on more or less the perimeter of campus with some exceptions. That's not the case anymore. And so while we're trying to balance accessibility so that people actually use the gazebos with distance to minimize issues associated with secondhand smoke, that can be a real challenge. So right now we have 6 gazebos. We've actually reduced the numbers. And so there's a lot more discussion that's required there. Yeah?
So we did discuss the issue of edibles, even though, sale won't be around for a while. The possession will be legalized. So currently, consumption of edibles is not covered under any existing UBC policies. One of the conversations we had was whether it will be treated like alcohol. However, alcohol, the way we treat alcohol is pursuant to the, a lot of the provincial regulations, so we'll have to wait and see what the province says about marijuana edibles before we can make any decisions on that topic. The other big issue is housing, both consumption and possession inside dorms. Now, the issues we've discussed was smoking, which is covered by most, if not all, of the leases already, possession of edibles, and some of the safety concerns like accidental consumption that arise out of that, cooking, and the smells that are potentially associated with that, as well as keeping cannabis plants in the residence, and the sometimes associated electricity costs and humidity associated with that. Now we did discuss all these issues, and the conclusion was that these decisions need not be made at the committee level. We've passed sort of all of our discussions to housing, and housing will be making the relevant decisions through amendments to the housing leases.
So sale of cannabis in smoking form and the associated accessories is currently banned in Policy 15. Policy 15, as Michael says, does not address cannabis in its edible or oil form, though we understand that the sale of edibles will not be legal for a while longer. We need some direction on that. Currently, through policy, we outright ban the sale of tobacco. And the sale of liquor is restricted to licensed establishments such as our pub and events with either an approved liquor license or an approved exemption. And we do not have any private liquor stores at this time, but we recognize that we're in close proximity to surrounding stores. So conversations regarding cannabis are still happening at the highest level of the executive. Our committee was not formed that long ago. This is very early days. And ultimately, these decisions have not been made, and if any policies are developed, there will be extensive consultation. So
Sure.
going forward.
Yeah, just want to, again, reiterate this point here that, any policy that does get developed will, require and solicit extensive student input. We do have 2 students sitting on our committee, which is Max Holmes, who's VP Academic of the Vancouver AMS, and Kelly Lou, who is an Okanagan student senator. And once a draft policy does go to the Board of Governors, we'll open it up for a consultation period, and we'll make sure that consultation period doesn't just happen, in the summer when no one's around, that it will cover months where, students are on campus and engaged. It's one of those things where, we're taking the time to get it right, and definitely want to solicit, every point of view that we can incorporate into this process. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley and Michael. So we want to extend our sincere thanks to all of our panel speakers today for their presentations and for responding to our questions. We also want to thank you all for joining us here at UBCO and online. We do want to hear from you about what other types of events and topics you would like in the future to continue the conversation we started today. We invite you to complete the evaluation form for today's session to let us know your thoughts. The evaluation will be emailed to everyone.
If you are interested in working with Voice on this topic or some of our other action groups, please email either Casey or Chelsea for more information. Their email addresses are up on the screen. In closing, we would like to thank Tracy Hawthorne, Director of UBC Wellbeing, for sponsoring the refreshments today, and Aramark for catering.
We would like to thank the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the Therapeutic, Recreational, and Problematic Substance Use Lab, UBC Wellbeing, and Campus Health for co-sponsoring this event today.
We would also like to thank UBCO TV for recording our event today, and we would like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us. For those of you joining us in person today, you received a questionnaire upon arriving. Please now take the time to fill that out and either leave it on your seat or put it in the bin located at the door. Additionally, please be sure to fill out our event evaluation form that you will receive via email, which will help us improve events like this in the future.